I want to introduce Grant Domke, who is a research forester based at the Forest Service Northern Research Station in Minnesota. That's part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Domke began his career with the USDA Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program within the agency's research and development area. He now works with the Carbon Science Group and helps compile estimates of carbon stocks and stock footage changes in forest each year as part of the U.S. commitment to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. His education, he started and got his undergrad at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, his master's at the University of Toronto, and his PhD at the University of Minnesota. He is going to talk about the carbon sinks and the carbon stock in the U.S. forest right now, and give us a sense of essentially the census of trees, giving us the big picture of how many trees are out there and how is that changing over time, and what will the impact of these new uses for wood products be on the carbon sink in the U.S. So Grant, I want to welcome you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Chris, and welcome everyone. So as Chris said, I'm going to give sort of a 30,000 foot level overview of the forest sector in the United States, and specifically the work that our group does within the USDA Forest Service as part of our commitment to the United Nations Framework Convention. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. I'm just a small part of this carbon science group, and really a collaborative effort between Forest Service scientists, university cooperators, and many other folks across state and federal agencies that we collaborate with. I'm a research scientist, so a lot of the work that I do is really in support of accounting and estimation that we do in support of different reporting. And all these reporting instruments are really seen as policy instruments to evaluate how our current policies and practices are impacting the forest carbon sink in the United States, and more broadly, the economy-wide carbon footprint in the US. So why is this important? Just to set the stage and provide a little bit of context. You've probably all seen these curves before. They're sometimes referred to as hockey stick curves, or the Keeling curve. So this really represents the CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. Before the early 1950s, we recorded and estimated the CO2 in our atmosphere using ice cores. So we would, not me, but scientists would work with ice cores, and using the bubbles that develop in these ice cores, they would estimate the CO2 concentrations in those bubbles dating back well before the Industrial Revolution period. But I'm showing that here because that's really what we're interested in today, is talking about sort of anthropogenic emissions and how anthropogenic emissions have contributed to increases in CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. And so that's been identified going back more than 100 years now. But since the early 1950s, we've been observing CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere from the Scripps Oceanographic Institute's Mauna Loa Observatory. And you can see the seasonality post 1950, where you can see this sort of exponential increase in CO2 concentrations. And these CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere, the increases have been tied to a whole variety of environmental changes, including increases in the temperature and also changes in precipitation patterns. So a disruption in our Earth system. And really that's been identified for a long, long time, as I said, but it was in the late 1980s, early 1990s that the international community came together and formed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That commitment or convention was entered into force in 1994. The United States was party to that convention. You're probably all familiar. The COP is about to start in Glasgow. Soon, the Conference of the Parties, where they'll be discussing commitments, what's been done in the past, and where we'll go in the future. This early convention was really established to act in the interests of human safety, even in the face of scientific uncertainty. There's a fair amount of uncertainty, particularly in the land sector to this day, but we know a lot more now than we did in the early 1990s. And really the emphasis or thrust for this convention was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate and Earth system. And so we're seeing some of those things now. This is just an illustration from the last National Climate Assessment from the United States, illustrating how increases in CO2 in our atmosphere have contributed to changes in our Earth system. So everything from increases in temperature to decreases in Arctic sea ice extent, increased heat waves, as you're all familiar with from the Western United States this year, increased or elevated sea levels, and a whole variety of other climatic and Earth processes are changing as a result of these increases in CO2 in our atmosphere. And so there's been commitments and put into place over the last decade really to curb our emissions, the economy-wide emissions. And in the United States, we've made several commitments initially to reduce emissions from 2005 levels by 17%. And then more recently in 2015, as part of the Paris Climate Agreement, to reduce our emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. And now, just recently, the Biden administration has put forward a commitment to reduce our economy-wide emissions by 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by 2030. And so these are substantial or drastic reductions in our carbon footprint and the activities that contribute to CO2 emissions in our atmosphere, and really more broadly greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere. And these commitments include the land sector and the forest sector in particular. And so relevance to recent commitments, so all categories, every sector of our economy will be included in the calculations of emissions reductions as defined and reported in the National Inventory Report, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. We'll be using a net approach. So basically just subtracting the emissions from 2025 or 2030 from those emissions in 2005 to understand whether or not we met those commitments. I think really relevant to this particular group is we'll be using the production approach to account for harvested products, consistent with how the IPCC guidance describes that approach. And then finally, we have language in the recent commitment and also in the commitment put forward in 2015 that we may exclude emissions associated with natural disturbances, again, consistent with IPCC guidance. So what is the NIR? So this is what inventory compilers like myself refer to the inventory of US greenhouse gas emissions and sinks. So this is an annual report that the Environmental Protection Agency coordinates. Many different entities contribute to this report. It comes out on tax day every year, on or around April 15th. And the Forest Service has long contributed to this report in the areas of the land sector in particular, and primarily the forest land category and harvested wood products. And since the early days of the UNFCCC, which Annex 1 countries are required to submit an annual accounting of economy-wide emissions and removals, the US is an Annex 1 country. So this report really represents part of that commitment that we've made to this convention. The Forest Service contributes to many aspects now, including the emissions and removals associated with urban trees, harvested wood, woodlands, so the perennial woody vegetation and grasslands, and then the forest sector, as well as characterizing how the land is changing, how the land uses are changing across the United States, across all the different categories within the land sector. And so to sort of paint a picture of how we go about understanding, estimating, and then reporting on the carbon stocks and transfers. So I commonly refer to what you see in blue here, these blue arrows, as transfers. So we've got transfers of carbon from the atmosphere into live vegetation, for example, through the process of photosynthesis. You probably all at least vaguely remember learning about photosynthesis in grade school and maybe into high school or college. That's really the process by which trees build carbohydrate, live vegetation more broadly, not just trees, accumulate carbohydrate, energy really, and some of that becomes sort of is carbon. So about 50% of the mass of a tree is considered carbon, right? Or rough numbers. That varies somewhat by region, etc. But about 50% of the wood and bark in a tree is carbon. And so this cartoon or schematic really shows the gray boxes represent these static pools where we're estimating, and you'll hear me refer to carbon stocks. So you can see the broad pools here. We've got the above ground biomass, below ground biomass, soil litter, dead wood, and then the wood products pool. So these are static pools, and those pools are moving, constantly moving through decomposition. Fires consume some of that carbon and the biomass, and that might return to the atmosphere. So there's a transfer to and from atmosphere, as well as transfers between these various pools. And so my job and the job of our group is really to characterize how these transfers occur, what causes the transfers, how long they stay in each one of these gray boxes. And collectively, we take all of that information and roll it up into the National Inventory Report each year, and reporting annual emissions and removals from the year 1990 to 2 years before present. So pretty much everything that I'll be describing today will be from the most recent inventory, which went through the year 2019. So how do we characterize these stocks, these carbon stocks in the gray boxes, as well as the transfers between the atmosphere and the land sector? Well, the primary data source that we use is, as Chris mentioned at the top of the call, I sit in the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, which is really the nation's forest census. Internationally, these censuses or these surveys of trees are often referred to as national forest inventories. So in the United States, the National Forest Inventory extends 15 time zones. It includes the entire continental United States, so I'll refer to that as the CONUS here, as well as Alaska, Hawaii, and then we also include the US territories. So this rather fuzzy map illustrates, first of all, the extent of the US National Forest Inventory, where you can see some green and brown out there in the oceans. Those represent the US territories and Hawaii, but also the continental United States, which we'll zoom in here in a second. The green represents the National Forest Inventory plots. So those are permanent plots that are established on forest land in the US, any amount of forest land at those particular points, and they're remeasured or visited every 5 to 10 years. So I'll zoom in here, and you can see that the distribution of those plots is pretty dense, at least at this scale. It looks quite dense. So there's on the order of 150,000 plots, you saw from the earlier screen, and more than 350,000 plots total. We only visit the forested plots. And like I said, we visit those every 5 to 10 years, and we collect all sorts of information on those plots, tree diameters and heights, and the species and the condition, if they were damaged or they're dead. And we go back and visit those plots, and we do the same thing again. How has that diameter changed? How has the height changed? Are there new trees on the plot? In addition to the tree measurements, we're also collecting site level information to understand if the site's been disturbed, as well as information on the dead trees, trees that have fallen or are standing and dead, litter material that's fallen, leaves or small branches or other material, as well as taking soil cores on a subset of the plot. So it provides sort of a baseline of information that we can then use methods and models to characterize the carbon in those different components to estimate the carbon stocks, and then with the remeasurements, how those stocks are changing through time and how carbon is moving through the forest ecosystem. And because we collect information not only on the forested plots, but also the other land uses using remotely sensed information, high resolution imagery, we can also identify if there was a land change, how much of that carbon was transferred to that new land use or not. So there's a lot more detail I could go into on the plot design and the sampling frame, but for the sake of time, that's all I'm going to say about the National Forest Inventory. But that really serves as the foundation to everything that I'll be describing from this point forward. And I should also say that all of these data are publicly available. So 6 months from the point that we wrap a diameter tape around a tree on a plot, those data are made public in a public facing database. And there are a variety of tools that folks can use, stakeholders with different skill sets can use to make estimates themselves using point and click buttons or downloading raw data themselves, or using summary statistics from reports like I'll describe in a few minutes. So where is the forest in the US and who owns all of that forest land? So this really illustrates broadly all the different colors represent forest land. So you can see how it's distributed across the continental United States. And then if you can look close, you can see how that forest is distributed by ownership. So in the eastern United States, the majority of the forest land is privately owned by industrial and non-industrial private forest landowners. Whereas in the western United States, you see the majority is a dark green color. The majority of the forest in the western US is federally owned. National Park Service, National Forests, within the USDA Forest Service. And so broadly speaking, across the entire United States, a little more than 50% of the forest land is private. And then the rest are local, state, federal lands, as well as tribal enterprises that own the remainder of the roughly 45% of the forest land. So kind of an interesting sort of regional contrast in who owns the forest. And really that contributes then to how the forest is managed and maintained for a variety of different, different, I guess, goods and services, if you will. There's approximately 310 million hectares of forest land in the United States, not just the CONUS here, and that represents about 1/3 of the entire US land base. And so how many trees occupy that forest land? In a recent paper, we estimated roughly 1.38 trillion trees exist on the CONUS forest land alone. So the 48 conterminous states of the US, there's an estimated 1.38 trillion trees, and the majority of those trees are seedlings. So they're small individuals with about 350 billion saplings and larger trees. So we talked a little bit about carbon stocks and the different pools of carbon. So these are the broad forest land carbon pools that we're interested in. So the above ground live and below ground live biomass, those are really the pumps of the forest. So those are the live trees interacting in a positive way with the atmosphere through photosynthesis to capture carbon from the atmosphere as they grow. Deadwood can store carbon for a long period of time. So we're interested in both the standing dead trees as well as the down dead wood. And then as that material might decompose, it might move to the litter carbon pool, where it's sloughed bark and or leaf material and other vegetation that may die in that sort of layer above the mineral soil. So the final pool is really the soil organic matter pool. And so just in rough numbers, the soil organic matter pool represents more than 50% of all the carbon stored in forests in the US. So it's a massive carbon pool, but it's relatively stable. It's not changing, as you'll see in a few minutes here. So now that we know where that information is coming from and the different pools that we're classifying the carbon into or categorizing carbon within the forest, what do we do with that? So through a lot of different statistical models and methods, we take that information from the inventory plots, and we have, based on those remeasurements, an idea of the net ecosystem exchange. So how much carbon was captured from the atmosphere in the forest, in live vegetation. And so that's a pretty large number. It's 971 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And I realize those units might at this point mean nothing to you. So I'll try to provide some context when we work through this cartoon in just a second. So you can see a lot of carbon is moved to the forest land, but not all of that carbon on an annual time step. And this represents just the year 2019. a lot of that carbon almost immediately moves out of the pool, of this forest land pool, through harvest. So there are a lot of harvest emissions or transfers, not all of the harvest. And that's a really important point, I think, for this group to understand that oftentimes harvesting gets portrayed as a negative from a carbon perspective. Certainly there are emissions associated with harvesting in terms of the machinery and even loss through decomposition or burning in harvest. So there's a transfer of a lot of that carbon to the wood products pool, which is really, I think, the focus of this group. So about 387 million metric tons in 2019 was transferred from the forest sector over to the wood products pool. Some of that remains in the wood products pool in products in use, or it ends up in landfills through various processes. And the rest of that material either decays through being left as slash in the forest, or is burned. And so that's where the wood pellets come into play, or firewood, residential firewood, or other processes. There are a whole variety of different products that can be used and burned for energy. And so you can see that there's the emissions from this burning end up, so there's this sort of cycle. Forests capture a bunch of carbon, some of that carbon is transferred to the wood products pool. A lot of that stays in long-lived products. Some of it is burned or decays through various processes and is returned to the atmosphere, either abruptly in the year that it was burned. And that's how we account for bioenergy, is that those emissions are considered in the year that they were harvested. If it's a wood pellet or if it's firewood, that carbon is returned to the atmosphere in the year that it occurs, or through decay, which is a longer process that we account for. There's also a variety of other transfers where you've got land converted to forest land. So we've got some carbon coming in from other land uses, as well as conversion of forest land to other land uses where we have losses. And so this schematic really illustrates the moving parts that the Forest Service and our group contributes to sort of describe these changes within the land sector. And so this is really sort of a key slide. And the net of all of this is that in 2019, the forest sector broadly, all the categories that we include, were a net sink of 775 million metric tons. And so forests alone, this 775, the forest component alone is equivalent to offsetting more than 10% of economy-wide CO2 emissions in the US each year. When you combine the forest sector with harvested wood products and urban trees, they collectively offset approximately 14% of CO2 emissions and about 11% of greenhouse gas emissions when you include all the non-CO2 emissions. So the US is the largest contributor. The forest sector is the largest net sink in the land sector and accounts for about 95% of the sink strength in the US each year. So what does that mean? Those are really large numbers. What is a million metric ton? So that 775 million metric tons is the equivalent of taking more than 168 million passenger vehicles off the road for a year. Or the emissions from 196 coal-fired power plants for 1 year. So a pretty substantial, a massive contribution to the overall carbon budget. And so what are the individual contributions and how are those things changing? So you can see that since about 1990, the forest land sink has declined. And there's a fair amount of interannual variability each year. And that interannual variability is driven in part by disturbance, land change, as well as harvesting. So disturbance can sort of include wildfire, insects and disease, and a variety of other natural phenomena, but also harvesting. So you can see that's changed some. And you can also see that over time, the overall emissions and removals have declined with, again, some pretty substantial interannual variability. 2005, for example, was a really down year for the forest sector because the wildfires in Alaska were really substantial. 2019, 2020, 2021, we're in the process right now of compiling the 2022 inventory. 2020, which is the next year in our time series, as you're all aware, was a massive wildfire year, and that contributed pretty meaningfully to the carbon sink strength. And those numbers will be coming out in the months ahead. So how does the forest land carbon sink and the sort of status of the sink, how has that changed relative to economy-wide CO2 emissions? So you can see here the contribution of forest land to emissions offsets in the US has remained relatively stable at around 14% since 2005, despite this sort of steady decline from 2005 in overall CO2 emissions. So this suggests that the carbon sink strength in the US, which again is driven in large part by regrowth, followed by, the regrowth following harvest and natural disturbance, is slowly diminishing. So the sink strength is slowly shrinking in the United States, while our total CO2 emissions are also shrinking. So you would expect if the forest was remaining stable, that the contribution of forests with the diminished economy-wide CO2 emissions or shrinking CO2 emissions, that the contribution of forests would actually be increasing, but they're not. So that's sort of not necessarily a concern, but that has raised a lot of questions on how can we give a boost and what activities can we do to enhance the sink strength or maintain that sink strength that we've enjoyed over this long time series. So now a series of maps. So where is the carbon? Where are the carbon stocks and forests in the United States? So the red represent large carbon stocks, and not surprisingly, the Pacific Northwest, a lot of the above ground biomass, those massive forests of the Pacific Northwest, as well as deep, rich soil carbon. A lot of the carbon in the US is found in the Pacific Northwest, as well as the northern lake states. So northern Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, there's a lot of soil carbon there. And then in the northeastern portion of the United States. So that's really where the carbon is located. And this is a county level map. In some cases, you can see due to data limitations in Wyoming and West Oklahoma, we were limited. So I apologize for those in terms of the distribution of carbon stocks. And so this describes here, again, the contribution of those carbon stocks. Where is that carbon? And so the total carbon stored here in forests right now is the equivalent of more than 30 years of fossil fuel emissions. So that the stock in US forests is massive. And you can see we've reported the stock of harvested wood as well. So the carbon accumulated both in products in use, as well as in solid waste disposal sites, so landfills. You can see how those estimates have changed and are gradually increasing, particularly since the Great Recession, where we saw some declines in wood utilization in 2008, 2009. Since that 2010, we're starting to see some recovery in that space, and the accumulation of carbon in those carbon pools has increased. So it's the carbon stocks, the standing stocks are interesting, but really the intent and the focus of the greenhouse gas inventory is how are things changing. And so this is an illustration of how carbon stocks are changing. So same county level maps, and you can see here that the majority of the carbon is again in the Pacific coast and the eastern United States. The eastern and southeastern part of the US is really the carbon pump of the United States. That's where the majority of the carbon is. Whereas in Intermountain West, due to slow recovery following natural disturbance, those forests actually represent a net source of carbon in some cases, represented here by the brown colors. So drilling down a little bit deeper, pick your favorite state. You can see here the contributions and the distribution of carbon by each of those carbon pools we described earlier, where again, the above ground live pool, that's the pool that's interacting most directly with the atmosphere, generally tends to be the largest component of the carbon stock changes each year. And you can see that if I were to draw circles around the major bars, so negative here, anytime we've got a removal from the atmosphere that is represented by a negative number. That's how we report removal. So you can see the major states are all in the southeastern part of the region of the Pacific Northwest. So Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, where some of you are just located, represent some of the largest net sinks in the US. And that's driven in large part to industrial forests. The fact that there's a lot of harvesting, rapid growth, that really represents the carbon pump in the United States, contributing substantially to the US carbon sink. Now, the carbon that's transferred following harvest to wood products. You spent a fair amount of time, I think, learning about harvested wood products, and particularly wood pellets and wood energy. There are a variety of different ways that we can account for the harvested wood as it moves from the forest sector and is transferred to the harvested wood product sector. So internationally, there are broadly 4 approaches: the stock change, the production approach, and the atmospheric flow approach. The US government, our group reports on all 3 in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, but we use the production approach in our calculations. So the production approach includes all harvested wood products produced from timber harvested in an area, as well as anything that was exported. So any wood that was cut in the United States and exported, we include the emissions from all that exported wood in our greenhouse gas inventory. We do not include the emissions from wood that was imported into the United States and used as any type of wood product, whether it was energy or otherwise. So drilling down a little bit closer, this illustrates how wood for energy, CO2 emissions from biomass burnt by producing and consuming countries are reported based on these different approaches that I just described. So again, the focus here is the production approach. So you can see unutilized wood harvest residues, we include those in the producing country. The harvested wood used directly as energy feedstocks, again, the US would account for those industrial residues. So all the different components here are included in our greenhouse gas inventory. Any wood that was cut. Showing it another way, this is a little bit complicated, but you can see the black box represents sort of the national boundary. And we might have imports of wood into our national boundary, but those are not included in the production approach. Instead, the gray box here really represents the harvested wood product system boundary, where we take all the wood harvested domestically, whether it was used domestically or exported, and we account for the emissions and removals or transfers really of those harvested wood products. So let's revisit just for a second the contribution of harvested wood products. So a net sink, a lot of the carbon is stored there, but as we talked about a few minutes ago, there's also a fair amount of emissions associated with the harvesting and then the decay and burning of that wood. And so, we're accounting for that, and that makes its way into the greenhouse gas inventory, either indirectly in the change in the forest land sink or directly in changes to our harvested wood products estimates. So a bit more detail on wood consumption. I've got, I think, 1 slide left, and then we can move to questions. So forest biomass is a renewable feedstock, as I'm sure you've learned, that may be used to produce a whole variety of different sources of energy: electrical power, heat, and/or liquid fuels. The material is abundant in many regions of the US, and the diversity of energy options obtained from forest biomass has led to the utilization of wood for energy in each of the major energy sectors. So you can see in the panel on your left, the 4 major energy sectors that we report on in the greenhouse gas inventory. You can see that the industrial sector, which is the primary user of wood for energy, and that includes pulp and paper and other wood producing mills. So where there's co-production or burning of wood for co-production, that's part of the reason that the industrial sector contributes so much. The graph on your right highlights a steady increase in the consumption of renewable energy since the 90s, particularly biofuels, wind and solar, which has contributed to some of the reductions that we're seeing in the economy-wide CO2 emissions that I noted earlier. And maybe this will come as a surprise to some of you. Wood consumption for energy has declined in the US since the mid-1980s, but still represents approximately 20% of the renewable energy consumption by source, and is third only to hydroelectric power and wind. So wood energy continues to play a major role in forested regions of the US, particularly the Southeast, the Northeast, and parts of the Pacific Northwest, and has consistently comprised around 2% of the total energy consumption. So that's this red line that you see in the graph on the right. That's wood energy contribution relative to total energy consumption, whereas the black line represents the contribution relative to all other renewable energy sources. So well over half of the emissions from wood consumption, as I mentioned earlier, are from energy in the industrial sector, where wood energy generation is mainly tied to the production of different wood products. And like I said, despite trends in wood consumption in the US, among wood energy feedstocks, wood pellets have increased in the last 10 years substantially, both domestically, but also worldwide. So there's been a rapid expansion in the generation of wood pellets, and that's represented some of the fastest growth in sort of wood energy and wood sector more broadly. The US accounts for over a quarter of the total production of wood pellets worldwide, with the US South having greater than 70% of the installed capacity to produce those wood pellets, and more than 60% of employment occurs in the southern part of the United States. And a lot of this expansion in the wood pellet industry internationally, but particularly in the South, has been attributed to international policies promoting the use of wood for energy. So here's just a quick comparison of the different estimates using those different approaches to compile harvested wood products emissions and removal. So you can see that they're different because the inputs and outputs are slightly different, but the blue bar there represents the contributions of the harvested wood products pool broadly to the net sink in the United States, where in 2019, it represented about 108 million metric tons equivalent. So with that, I'd just like to close here by saying that the Forest Service continues to be a major producer and consumer of data and data products to produce the kind of information that you just saw, to inform carbon science management and reporting instruments like I described here. The FIA data continue to really be a foundation, although we're really expanding how we use remotely sensed information and other sensors and stationary weather data and FluxNet information with those inventory data to get a more refined picture of how carbon is moving through the Earth system. We're moving beyond monitoring to also better understand and inform mitigation activities. And we continue to improve all of these things through collaborations and partnerships. And I'll just close by saying all of this work is really to inform policy and land management practices across scales. So with that, I think there is a few minutes for questions. I can't see my clock.
Yeah, so we have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question, raise your Zoom hand or stick it in the chat.
I have a question relating to what you said about carbon accounting and how emissions that are released from burning forestry products in other countries outside of the US are counted in US calculations. Could you expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so whether the wood is used domestically for energy or abroad, those emissions estimates end up making their way into the US greenhouse gas inventory. So we compile, so any exports of wood, whether it's used in long-lived wood products or is burned for energy, we account for those emissions in the United States, whether it's in the forest category in the case of CO2, or in the case of the energy sector and non-CO2 emissions.
For example, if some wood was sent to Europe and burned there, that's included in the US calculations, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
David Borax from WFAE, the NPR station in Charlotte, North Carolina. I wanted to ask if you could explain a little bit more about the use of wood pellets for energy in the US. Is that a significant part of that number on your chart, or are we mostly getting credit for burning of pellets overseas?
Yeah, so like I said, based on the latest statistics that we have from EIA and others, the wood consumption for energy, whether it's pellets or other sources, has remained relatively stable and actually declined relative to other renewables over time, but it's really represented around 2%. And we haven't seen that number increase much domestically. What we have seen is a real spike in the production of biomass pellet feedstocks for export. So domestic production and international consumption. Oop, you're on mute.
So that suggests that domestic use of wood pellets is going down, and mostly the increase here or the change in that is due to overseas use.
Yeah. So I think so. So the mix of how domestic wood consumption, there of course have been some evolution in the use of wood for energy over time. But overall, wood consumption has not increased markedly. In fact, it's remained relatively stable since the mid 1980s.
And sorry, one last.
You muted yourself again,
Sorry.
David.
How is it used in the U.S.? Where is it used? It's not. Is it used in manufacturing, or are we including in here people who burn it in their wood stoves, or?
Yeah. So everything. So you saw those 4 energy sectors. One of them is the residential sector. So that's firewood consumption. A lot of it, like I said, the industrial sector is the largest consumer of wood for energy, and really most of that represents cogeneration at wood products facilities where they might be making pulp and paper and other things, and they're also burning, black liquor or other extracts, or directly wood pellet, a variety of different feedstocks for energy.
All right, so we'll go to, I'm going to ask a question from Mark Heller, and then we'll go to Sarah Gibbons. So this is from Mark Heller of E&E News. The photo on the final thoughts slide shows snags, the dead trees, along with saplings. Is that setting a more effective carbon sink if the snags are removed or if they're left alone?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So it really depends how those snags would be used. In this case, those snags I don't think have much utility as a wood product. They're quite old. That represents that was a stand replacing fire in actually in Ontario of a jack pine fire, I think, if I recall. I can't even remember my last slide picture. But essentially, if it's used in a long-lived wood product, because those snags, depending upon, again, it's geographically specific. So snags can persist on the landscape for a really long time. If it's dry and warm, those snakes can persist for a really long time, or cool and wet in some cases. It's those wet and warm environments that break down wood rather quickly, decompose. And so in some cases, utilizing, capturing the mortality, you might have heard that in sort of forestry speak, capturing mortality and utilizing that in wood products, especially long-lived wood products, may be a better alternative in some cases than letting that material lie on the forest floor. If from a carbon perspective, if it's going to decompose quickly and return to the atmosphere. So it really depends. It's geographically dependent. And what the fate of that would be from a wood products perspective. If it's used for energy, remember those emissions are reported in the year of that it's being burned. So basically, we consider instant oxidation, so loss to the atmosphere immediately upon harvest in the year of removal if it was used for energy, versus if it was for household lumber. That material can persist in the system and accumulate and remain there for 100 years.
Right, thanks. And this is a bigger question, I gather, right now in places like California, for instance, than in much of it
is a concern. And I mean, I think that's one of those cases where the fuel loads that exist in some of these areas. So there's past management legacies that have led to conditions that are burning even fire-prone ecosystems differently than they would have burned 100 years ago. And so again, part of it is markets. Where are there markets for this material? And that contributes to how we can manage and effectively manage and support management. There's a cost associated with that. And if there isn't a market to sort of remove some of that material and use it, whether it's for energy or for long-lived wood products, doesn't matter. Those harvests probably won't take place.
Right. Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, let's go to, first of all, let me just ask, Bob Apt, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, is it okay? It's 11:50 right now. Is it okay if we start you, a few minutes late, so we can get a few more of these questions in.
Yeah, no problem. As long as I'm not cut off at the end, that's
Okay,
All
good
right.
deal. Yeah, no, we don't have a hard stop at 12:30. We can go
Okay.
beyond that. All right,
Hey,
thanks.
Bob.
Hey, Grant.
Okay, next go to Sarah.
Hi, this is Sarah from National Geographic, and my question is about tipping points. I'm wondering if there's been any research on at what rate trees would have to be harvested to transition any of these regions from carbon sinks to sources.
Yeah, well, I think in some cases we started to see tipping points, more a result of changes in sort of disturbance dynamics in the West, extreme events that we're seeing in the Intermountain West, and slow recovery post disturbance. So I think we are starting to see some tipping points, particularly in the Intermountain West, where you're having these systems that are not recovering to forest. And by tipping point, I guess what I might describe that as is a natural land conversion. And so certainly there are those cases where we've seen them on the landscape due to natural phenomena. It's happening in parts of the Intermountain West. It's also happening in parts of Alaska, where we've got permafrost thaw and we've got these sort of drunken forests, they call them, where there's really not substrate for regeneration to establish and take root. So we're seeing changes there due to wildfire and warming. So those tipping points there are natural sort of analogs that exist there. I think from a forestry perspective, particularly parts of the industrial forest land in the United States, there's a real effort made to maintain forest as forest and continue to manage and maintain those ecosystems as forest land. And so in a lot of circles, I think forestry and forest management in general is seen as a good thing because it really maintains forests and really enhances or maintains that sink strength. So well, I certainly think there are places where it could happen. I think in the United States, for the most part, forest management activities, well, maybe haven't been the best for changes in climate and other things in parts of the U.S. The intention is good to maintain forests as forest.
Okay, let's go to Jake.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jake. I'm a freelancer in Tucson, Arizona. And from Enviva and a lot of these other biomass companies, we've learned that when they harvest these polyculture multi-tree species forests, they're generally replacing them with plantations of a monocrop. And I'm wondering if there's a difference in the amount of carbon that's able to be put into the sink in these trees based on the difference between like a polyculture forest and a kind of a monocrop plantation.
Yeah, good question. So certainly there's been a lot of research looking at sort of mixed species, multi-cohort stands, and the contribution or the sequestration capacity of those ecosystems relative to plantations. And I think part of it, it starts with the site, right? What's the capacity of the site to grow biomass or grow a crop? And that capacity is fixed unless you introduce some sort of amendment there, some sort of fertilization or watering or other thing. And so, I think there have been plenty of studies that suggest that, those multi-species forests tend to be more productive, or at least as productive as some of the improved growing stock plantations or single species plantations that exist out there. I think some of the bigger questions lie with resistance and resilience to natural disturbances. And monocultures, single species stands may not be as resistant or resilient to changes in natural disturbance dynamics as those multi-species stands, and therefore may be more prone to loss of sequestration capacity or stocks due to fire, wind, or other insects and disease. And so it's a complex question. But there have been a lot of studies looking at sort of the mixed species multi-cohort systems, not just in forests, but also in grasslands and a variety of other ecosystems, suggest there is a place where that mixture can actually increase productivity overall in the system. And that includes not just the live trees, but more broadly, a variety of other, the ecosystem more broadly, not just the individual trees. So it's a challenging question. And I think, from an intensive forest management perspective, the goal is to grow trees fast. And so, from a sequestration perspective, that's a good thing. That positive interaction with the atmosphere is a good thing. You're accumulating a lot of carbon quickly. But what happens to that carbon then long term? The fate of that carbon is still important in terms of what the atmosphere sees and also what we report on.
Okay, just one comment from a fellow that we're dealing with that in Maine with the ash borer beetle issue.
So I'd just point you to a paper that actually we just published looking at the role of insects and diseases on the carbon sequestration capacity of forests. And
this is Sean Cunningham from WAGM. I was the one who typed that question. I'm sorry you can't see me. I'm dealing with the flu. I'm glad we're on Zoom this week as I'm dealing with the flu. But I was the one who I didn't want anyone to hear me because I'm dealing with the worst voice issue. But yes, that's exactly what we're dealing with in Maine, the ash borer issue.
I don't want to take any more of Bob's time, but maybe what I'll do is I'll send Chris a recent paper. It was just published, I think, a week or two ago, looking at the role of insects and disease on carbon sequestration capacity of forests in the US. And what we're seeing, is that where there's evidence of insects in particular, those forests have their sequestration capacity is reduced by more than 60%. And so they are having an impact on the sink strength in the US. And oftentimes those insects or diseases are part of combo disturbances. So there's other things that play there as well that might lead to more abrupt emissions, not just reduced sequestration capacity, but also emissions due to other disturbances like wildfire if trees start to die or are stressed and not capable of resisting fire in those fire-prone ecosystems. So good question. I think there are efforts, in every state to sort of combat some of these things, but it's costly, and I think there's management targeted at sort of maintaining and sort of moving away from some of these tree species that are prone to insects and diseases. But we also want to maintain those native species to the extent we can. So I think there are a variety of things happening research-wise, and also even in a production space to try and maintain those tree species, which I think is important from a carbon sink perspective as well.
Thank you.
I'll share that paper with Chris.
Thank you so much.
So Grant, I want to thank you very much. And fellows, I'll be sharing. We've put some of these resources from Grant on our resources list already, but I'll get more of them, including the National Forest Inventory and some of the papers that he was referencing in his PowerPoint, as well as the paper he's referencing right now. We will now switch to our next Greek speaker. And Bob, I want to thank you very much for being flexible on the start time of this. We never like to cut off questions, so we're glad to be able to get some more questions in. But Bob Apt is the Carl Alwyn Schenck Professor Emeritus at North Carolina State University. He has more than 25 years of experience in research in bioeconomic modeling of forest resources, forest carbon, and markets. He also works with environmental NGOs, the EPA, the U.S. Forest Service, and the National Academy of Sciences on domestic forest market issues. He did his undergrad at Georgia Tech, his master's at the University of Tennessee, and his PhD from Cal Berkeley. And he is going to talk about the forest and wood products industry from the economic standpoint. And I will turn it over to Bob right now.
Thanks, Chris. And I actually enjoyed listening to Grant's talk at the end. Everything I do on the biologic side is based on U.S. Forest FIA data. So as a country in this conversation about climate and forests, the FIA data gives us a real advantage over most places. So I'm emeritus professor. My old position has been taken by Justin Baker, so I've added him to this slide. We work in the same space. This is mostly tied to my specific work, but the question about markets and the scale of looking at bioenergy is something that we both worked on. I'm not a carbon accountant. I work with carbon accounting. People link carbon accounting to my model. My whole career actually has been based on trying to project forest impacts from increased demands or more risk and factors like that. And so I was in this space modeling the southern forest before pellets came into the picture. So from my perspective, it was another use of the forest coming in, and my specialty is sort of how will this forest play out with a new demand. And if you're familiar with the literature, right, there's a lot of literature, especially US and part of the EU and part of Canada, right, where markets aren't part of it. In other words, this either a forest level or a stand level biological analysis, and that's where the terms, carbon debt comes up. So if you, for example, were a landowner and you cut your forest and sold it to be used for pellets, right? The forest you cut had sequestered carbon out of the atmosphere for that, say, 30 years or so. It'd be emitted back in the atmosphere, and how the carbon accounting would play out would depend on whether you replanted and a lot of factors like that. So that's sort of the stand level perspective. And really, in a lot of places where the market's not very strong, which would probably fit part of the Canada and some of the EU, that may be the dominant dynamic in the story. And pellets ended up in the US South, which we'll talk about a little bit, for reasons of convenience. But the US South is a pretty unique place to consume wood. In other words, it's quite different than anything else in the world. And so I'm going to be talking about the southern forest and try to give you some background. I know some of you, this may be redundant, and some of you, this may be brand new, but without that background, I don't think I could tell my story. And the bottom line is, the US South is at least one place in the world where you cannot ignore markets, because the whole existence and future of what is in the southern forest and how it changes has always been tied to markets. So I'm not going to talk about this. This is background that you can look at, and this is mostly the background I just gave you. I do modeling at a scale. My goal was based on the idea that we have good biological data in the South. And while I don't think anyone, not even the Nobel Prize economists, can predict demand, it's not too hard to predict supply, right? In other words, I can look at how many 10-year-old trees there are on the landscape, and I can pretty much come up with a good idea of how many 20-year-old trees there'll be 10 years from now, right? There's a lot of dynamics in that, but the supply side is not that hard to get a handle on. My modeling perspective is try to get empirically driven supply side data together for people to look at various demands, right? So a lot of my work right now is for new sawmill capacity coming into the South from Canada, partly because of what's happening with the insects and fires in Canada. And so the question is, what happens when a new sawmill comes into an area? How does it affect how the forest develops? And that's a market-based story. So the key questions that lead to thinking, or how I think about pellets, is on the demand side, how does increased demand for wood affect prices, harvest, inventory, and carbon, right? And as you as an individual landowner make an independent decision, you are probably influenced by the market, right? Prices probably affect your decision to harvest, but you as a small landowner aren't big enough to affect the market. So you're a price taker, you're not a price influencer. The question for me, and it wasn't really resolved until recently in terms of how big the pellet industry is it going to be big enough to be a market influencer? And if it's a market influencer, then there's a whole different dynamic that plays out. And that's what this presentation is about. The other thing I'm concentrating on, which I won't emphasize so much today, but are things like hurricanes, right? So, if you own trees in the Gulf region, especially, your risk assessment of long-term investment in trees has changed a lot. And that's going to affect the supply side there, which affects markets and ripples throughout the South. So I'm going to go over the South and just, so Chris, are people allowed to ask questions along the way, or are you holding all questions till the end?
It's entirely up to you. If you want to engage questions as you go along, let the fellows know.
Okay, especially if it's a clarification. In other words, we're going to go through a lot of stuff, and if before I leave a slide, you have a question that would help explain what I was trying to say, I'm perfectly okay with that, as long as, Chris, you're in charge of watching to see who has questions.
Yeah, I'm watching and see if anybody raises a hand or
Okay.
puts a question into chat.
Okay. So we'll talk about sort of general over sort of satellite level view of the US South and what the status of the forest is and what the history's been for the last 20 or 30 years. We'll talk about the market context that pellets came into, and then what matters in terms of how the market effects play out when pellets came into the market. So I think you've had field trips, and you've had some of you are experts on this, and some of you were first exposed to this. But if you were on field trips between Raleigh and the coast, you might have come away with the perspective that most of the South is pine plantations, right? When I drive to the coast from here, I'm headed toward 2 big paper mills that are on the coast and several sawmills. And so the Highway 40 goes through a lot of pine plantations. But southwide, pine plantations are only 26 of the timberland in the South. It's concentrated in the coastal plain, but it's not all in the coastal plain. But even though it's only 26% of the timber area, over half of all removals, that's pine and hardwood removals, come out of the pine plantation resource. And over 2/3 of pine removals come from pine plantations. So, so the pine plantations represent the sort of intensive management margin of the forest. In other words, that's where when prices increase, there may be some shift of marginal ag land or natural pine land into pine plantations at the extensive margin, but people who are growing trees have more of an incentive to do fertilization and other enhancements as well. So in terms of the dynamics of the forest, pine plantations have a big influence. So this is looking at, the left side is what I get out of the FI data. It's the history of merchantable volume of trees over a time period that's consistent with the graph on the right, which is one of John Colston's graphs on the same time period, roughly the same time period for the US South. And I do this for a couple of reasons. One is you can see there's a pretty high correlation in the slope of this land above. This is really above ground carbon, and merchantable volume is even smaller than that, right? It doesn't include the limbs and those kinds of things. But it turns out the above ground biomass is the dominant above ground source of carbon, right? And so that's been going up in the South for the last, really, since we clear cut the whole country in the turn of the century. That inventory has been going up. But I want to bring this up not only to show this correlation. In other words, this is what I model. I do carbon accounting off of this data, but this is the dominant above ground carbon stock. But I also want to point out, we're not going to talk about soil carbon, but right, most of the carbon in forest is in the soil, and soil carbon doesn't change quickly. In other words, over time in a given land use, it may slowly accumulate carbon in a forest, and it may slowly lose carbon in an ag setting. But where there is a big soil carbon influence is when land use changes. So if land moves out of ag into forest and stays there, right, over time it accumulates carbon. If it moves out of forest into ag, over time it loses carbon. That's an important dynamic that if you're talking about carbon, people pass over because it's pretty hard to get data on. But I just want to up front say it does matter, especially land use change. In other words, if a land use change coming from an extra demand or a less demand is where probably the largest carbon influence in the long term will be, although we don't often capture that. These are some numbers I pulled together just on what other trends been in the southern pine forest inventory. That graph I just showed you showed an increase, and to compare it to other parts of the US. So if you're in another part of the US, you may have what you're surrounded by may be quite different than what you would see in the Southeast, and it's certainly different than most other countries. But you can see that the West has by far the highest pine forest inventory, the US West, compared to other US regions. And it's gone through sort of long-term cycles. And that's right, the trees are huge, they're long, they grow for a long time, there's a huge amount of stock there. US South pine forest inventory has actually doubled over this 1950 to 2012 time period. And you can see that the northern pine forest inventory has been going up. So the inventory has been going up. And you might think, well, that must be because removals are going down, but in fact, here's southern removals. So pine removals also doubled over that period, right? So that tells you that there's a dynamic going on where you're not just subtracting wood from the inventory and then filling it back up. There's a dynamic where actually removals are increasing at a faster rate actually than inventory, and the inventory is still going up. So there must be something going on at the either land use margin or the intensive management margin for that to be true. The boxes on the bottom are just to point out, almost all the planting in the US happens in the South. That's where the plantations are. Almost all of the forest land in the South is private. Less than a quarter of the forest land out west is private. And the South has a younger forest, right? Over half of the forest in the South are less than 40 years old. Well, that's partly because they're heavily utilized, so they're harvested. And on pine plantations, right, the optimal financial age is less than 40 years old. So thinking about the South relative to other areas, its stock might be lower, but its sequestration rate would be higher, right? It has younger, faster growing trees. So from a carbon perspective, that would be, it won't be as big a player on the stock side, but it's likely to be a big player on the sequestration side. In other words, that growth means it's sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere. So that's just putting the South in context. If you look within the South across forest types, it's interesting as well. So so here's the area of land, right? So here's the 26% or so that's in planted pine. What's the most common forest type in the US South is upland hardwood, followed by planted pine, and then natural pine and lowland hardwood, right? So if we were doing a type map, that's how the proportions would work out. But where's the carbon stock? So that's, where's the standing carbon in the forest? Well, upland hardwoods dominate that. Why? Because they're older. Their average age may be in the 60 to 80 range, depending on the region. Planted pine don't live long enough to get much stock, and they're thinned as well, right? So in terms of carbon stock, upland hardwood is important. Now, I'm not going to focus on the upland hardwood story too much, but the biggest I guess negative in terms of thinking about upland hardwood future is, if you're familiar with the Southeast, right? There's an urban crescent going from DC through Richmond, through where I am in Raleigh, through Charlotte, over to Atlanta and into Birmingham. And in long-term projections, that's projected to be one big city. And that's an upland hardwood Piedmont area. So upland hardwoods are likely to be the forest type most affected by urban expansion, right? Where the pine plantations are in the coastal plain, on the coast, the development has pretty much happened, and there's less development in the coastal plain than in the upland hardwood region. Right, carbon sequestration is tied to the growth rate, right? This is how much is standing in the forest. This is how much is being sucked out of the atmosphere, which is proxied by the growth rate. And you can see that planted pine is the dominant forest type from a sequestration of carbon point of view. Upland hardwoods are second most important because they cover so much of the landscape. So this is a perspective of sort of how the forest matrix is made up in terms of where the carbon is versus where its carbon is being sequestered. If you look at timberland acres over time, this green line is on the right axis. So actually timberland in the South has been pretty flat for the last 30 years or so. But that flat total is sort of hiding a dynamic underneath. Here's upland hardwood, and you can see it's starting to trend down. But here's the main dynamic in the 80s and 90s, which is pine plantations going up really at the expense of natural pine, right? When this data started, there was more natural pine than pine plantation. And you can see there's a symmetry between pine plantations going up and natural pine going down up until about 2008 or so. Right, so that argument about, oh, we're going to move the harvest intensity to the planted stands and relieve the tension on the natural stands really was sort of a shallow argument at the time where you were cutting down natural pine to put in pine plantations. But it is sort of interesting that in the last decade or so, natural pine acres have actually gone up some and planted pine acres have leveled out, except in the very latest data. So that's the dynamic among, we looked at carbon among forest types. This is the time trend across forest types. And so now we're going to move into sort of thinking about the Southern resource in general. So this is a snapshot from the University of Maryland Global Forest Change site. And I just zoomed in, and it may be hard to see without boundaries on here, but here's the Outer Banks, North Carolina, here's Florida, Georgia would be right in here. And you can see that it's dominated by this purple color. And if you look at the Pacific Northwest, you'd see a fair amount of this purple color. If you look globally, you wouldn't see much of this. And that purple color, which is in this tiny legend over here, is in the period of this snapshot from 2000 to 2012, purple means that there's both a loss and gain of forest land. So I bring this up because this is another showing how dynamic the Southern forest resource is compared to most other regions. In other words, it's got a lot of activity going on. But the other thing to note is this is the importance of land use versus land cover, right? This satellite is picking up land cover. So when a forest is harvested, it's really hard to tell it from a cornfield or any other sort of ag system. So from a purely land cover point of view, it looks like it goes out of forest. Most of these stayed in the forest land use the whole time. So the land use, there wasn't really a loss in forest land. There was a loss in forest inventory, but the land was still in a forest use. So it's important when you look at the dynamic in the system, especially using the increased use of remote sensing. One of the big things in forestry is to make sure you're capturing a land use change rather than just a land cover change. Oops. Okay. This, however, is getting at land cover. So this is a long, it's sort of a, around 2000 study, but this is hard data to get. So this is actually going out to field measurements or field observations of how the land is being used. And the time period they're looking here is from 1982 to 1997, right? And these colors mean that if it's this yellow color, what you see is predominant out west, then that means that over 5% of the land of the forest in that land, or forest in that area, went to agriculture during that period. If it's green, that means over 5% of the ag land in that pixel went to forest land. So this is a pretty important dynamic. And again, it sort of shows how the South is unique. In the South, the South is a matrix of marginal ag land, marginal in the sense of it can't compete with Midwest in terms of ag productivity. So it's a matrix of marginal ag land with productive forest land that has strong markets. So there's a lot of back and forth at the margin between forest and ag. And we've mentioned that that margin is probably the most important dynamic in terms of carbon, right? Forest going to ag as a loss of cover, and then probably has soil carbon implications if it stays there, and vice versa. So this was studied by Ruben Lebowski. So, and I spent a fair amount of time talking to folks in the EU about the Southern market. And this first sentence here is a scary sentence to think about if you're from a sort of a different cultural environment. This is a privately owned, largely unregulated landscape where marginal agriculture competes with forest land, both at the intensive margin in terms of plantation and at the extensive margin with marginal agriculture. So privately owned and largely unregulated. Often these two, well then, if it's privately owned and largely unregulated, I imagine it's all clear cut all the time. And of course, the reason it's not is because there's value to growing trees. And so the conversion to pine plantation is someone making a financial decision to convert to forest, and they may, again, right, they may not pay much attention to biodiversity, and their harvest age is going to be based on the price of saw timber and pulpwood, right? But and so they will likely cut the forest, right? There are alternatives. Hunting leases in the South actually can make a fair amount of money, but forest product markets are the dominant driver. So what you see because of this is the emergence of plantations being intensively managed, right? That plus strong markets. Now, Ruben Lebowski, who used the data we looked in the previous map, here was the key conclusion from his study looking at that 1982 to 1997 time period. The main reason that forest area went up in his econometric model is the rise in timber net returns. So that's the most important factor driving the increase in forest area over this period, right? So that was a Harvard PhD, which is pretty impressive all by itself. But it turns out Ruben, who I've worked with on stuff, is currently the lead economist at EDF. And so I used his dissertation for the story, and I've gone back to him and he stands by it. So it's not really a surprise, but being able to empirically show it, I guess, takes a lot of work. So if this is true, if timber rents, which are net returns to timber, are a driver of land use change, back to the topic we were after here, is what does this mean for carbon consequences of increased demand for pellets, right? If pellets weren't big enough to have a market impact, then they would just be cut, they would just be part of cutting is not quite the same as a single stand analysis, but they would just remove trees. And by the way, they don't tend to own forest land. So if a pellet mill comes in and clear cuts a forest, the landowner might decide to put in pine plantations, but the pellet company, all they did was provide an opportunity to clear the forest. So, and that does matter. In other words, for example, if Enviva provides a market for low quality hardwoods and someone wants to change to pine plantations, it's easier for them to do that if there's a market for low quality wood. So you could identify pellets as a reason that some land is converted to pine plantation, not because the pellet mill prefers it, but because the landowner is looking for an opportunity to convert, and that provides them that opportunity. Well, let's look at pellets and how important it is and whether it will have a price effect and how that might play out. So before pellets came in, and actually most of my career, the primary returns to forest landowner who are managing forest for income is pine saw timber, right? Those big logs that goes in to make lumber to make houses. In that time period, it was so much more valuable than pulpwood, which are the small trees that usually go to pulp mills, but also now go to pellet mills, that when you thought about returns to timberland, the price of the pine pulpwood really didn't factor much. And so one thing that if pellets were to have an impact in those days, the fact that they have raised pulpwood prices by adding demand for pulpwood really would not have changed landowner behavior, because really the silviculture during that time was really all about minimizing pulpwood because pine saw timber was so valued. Right? So if we're headed to a story where under what circumstances would pellets affect the market and perhaps lead landowners to make different decisions, the first problem they have to overcome is they're using the least valuable resource. So for pellets to influence land rents, which is tied back to Lebowski stuff, if pellets influence land rents, then they have the potential to affect land use change and land use management, which may have a carbon benefit, right? In other words, if marginal ag land comes in to trees because of that price differential, then that's a pretty positive carbon story. If a natural forest gets converted to pine plantation, that's a loss of carbon stock and maybe a gain in sequestration. But the first thing have to happen is pine pulpwood needs to be more important related to pine saw timber. And the second thing is pellets need to be big enough to influence prices. So, when pellets first started being part of the conversation, the Pellet Association's story was, we're just going to pick up what everybody else isn't using. We're not going to have any effect on markets. We're not really going to be cutting down trees. We're just going to be picking up residues. And why would they say that? Two reasons. One is the paper companies are the big player, right? And so part of it is you want to minimize your disturbance effect on the people using pulpwood by saying you're not really going to use pulpwood. So that was one reason. And then another is the carbon story seems a lot better if you're just using residues than if you're harvesting wood as well. But if you just ran the numbers, there's really no way, right? If you think of how much area you would have to cover to pick up residues to feed a pellet mill, there's no way the economics works out. So I was dubious of that from the beginning. And of course, it's played out where they're basically using pulpwood. And so then the question is, are pellets going to be big enough to affect the pulpwood market? So we'll look at those two questions next. All right, so here's the old days. 2005, pine saw timber was $42 a ton. Pine pulpwood was $8 a ton. It was a 5-to-1 ratio. These were the days where the silviculture and the returns to landowners was really a pine saw timber story. And then there's the recession, right? 2009. So it goes from above 40 to about $25 a ton. And it's been $25 a ton since then. So I have a whole presentation talking about this, but basically what happened was there was so much planting in the 80s and 90s that coincidentally, when we came out of the recession, there was what people call a wall of wood coming into the market. So while demand for wood went back up, prices of wood stayed down. So now where we are today, and really pine saw timber prices still have not come up. There's a little bit of a nudge that people are hopeful about, but it's still pretty small. So now pine pulpwood is, almost half, maybe a little bit less than half of the value of a saw timber. So if you're trying to figure out returns to landowners, what happens in the pine pulpwood market is all of a sudden more important. Not because of anything that pellets did, 100% due to the fact that pine saw timber prices have dropped by half and have stayed that way for the last 20 years. So pine pulpwood has become more important, right? So one of the conditions for pellets to affect markets happened not because of pellets, but because of what happened in the saw timber market. Are pellets big enough to matter? So here's million green tons used for pellets. I think in Viva mills were warming up about here and really came online in 2009. And, and it's been going up and it's still projected to go up. I have a slide that shows we're not at peak pellets. Yes, yet. That, that's just looking at pellets. How does it look in the context of other consumers of pulpwood? And that's what this graph is. Here's, I'll just say paper companies, right? But here's the consumption of pulpwood by pulp and paper mills, independent of pellets. And it turns out, unlike the recession having an effect on the decreasing demand for saw timber, packaging has taken off, right? I recycle piles of Amazon boxes myself, right? So that market took off, and right, and the COVID actually probably has put a kink in that curve, and it's probably even more important now than it's shown in this graph. So here's the pellet. So that if I put that graph that was previously, it was just pellets. So I put that on top of the consumption by paper mills, this is what it looks like. So it's about 15% as big as pulp mill consumption of pine pulpwood. But, right, so you might say, well, and actually the pellet companies continue to say, well, we're not really big enough to matter. And there was another story about paper mills can outcompete pellet mills any day, so there's not really going to be much competition. But the pellet mills may be small, but Drax, the bioenergy company that's consuming all the mills, is not small, right? So they're going to pay whatever it takes, right? So, so there is real competition here. And if you add that 15% extra demand on the all-time highest pine pulpwood consumption ever, then you will have a market effect, right? So this, again, it wasn't due to pellets, except maybe the luck of their timing, but they happened to come into the market at the all-time high demand for pine pulpwood. And this is interesting to note too, especially from an NVIVA perspective. What's happening to hardwood pulpwood? It's been steadily going down. So there is a story that's told, which is we're just replacing the declining pulpwood industry. And that's true only if you talk about hardwood pulpwood. Hardwood pulpwood is what's used to make the paper that used in printers and copying machines to find papers. And that's been going down. And there's a little bit, NVIVA is essentially the only pellet company that I'm aware of that really uses much hardwoods. And they're not really very big to matter, but again, in context, in some regions, and I imagine on the field trip, you might have been in some of these regions, they are the really only consumer of hardwood pulpwood. So in the pine world, they're adding demand to an all-time high. And in the hardwood world, they might be sort of softening the decrease in hardwood pulpwood. So what do they use? This is from For Risk. They use mostly softwood pulpwood. Residuals here is almost everything that's not roundwood, right? So it's listed down here. There's logging residues. So there's residues from the harvest. There's mill residues. Mill residues are probably the largest part of this. Again, NVIVA uses probably mostly hardwood in North Carolina, Virginia. The rest of the industry uses dominantly pine or softwood, and they all use residues. Mill residues are in high demand both by paper companies and pellet companies. And for example, if the Netherlands passes a rule that pellets going into the Netherlands have to be based on mill residues, what I think will happen is there's probably enough mill residues that they could all switch to mill residues, right? This is a lot, but the paper company will just switch from mill residues to roundwood. So what happens in the forest really won't change much, right? The pellets won't have a choice. They will, if they're going to serve that market, they will have to use mill residues, but the paper companies will just not compete with the mill residues anymore and replace their consumption of roundwood. This is a side note, right? Why is NVIVA in hardwoods and why are they in North Carolina, Virginia? The Franklin, Virginia paper mill, which used hardwoods, closed 2 years before they started siting their pellet mills. It's near the coast. There was a logging and trucking infrastructure already in place. When the mill closed, it was $7 a ton before the mill closed. It was $2 a ton after the mill closed. So that was the strategic reason NVIVA located in that region, and they're essentially consuming the same resource that mill was consuming. And hardwood pulpwood is a different thing. On pine, it's just a small pine tree, a small young pine tree. On hardwoods, it's a hardwood tree that is not high enough quality to go to a sawmill, right? It has to be straight, it has to be a species they want. And so pine pulpwood could be a very large tree that's crooked, right? And so you often see pictures of trucks going into the NVIVA mills that use hardwoods that have very large trees, right? And so that's why. In other words, the landowner decided to cut that forest. Everything that was high value went to a sawmill, either pine or hardwood. The small pine trees went to a paper mill, but there's not a demand for hardwood pulp much anymore. except for mills. And so you can have a very large crooked or heart rot log truck taking that into Enviva. And that's not saying that's good or bad. It's just saying that's what the paper company was doing before that. And that's almost the definition of pine hardwood.
Bob, just looking at the clock here, we did get started about 15 minutes late, but I'm just looking at the clock and hoping to wind up the presentation that, in the next 5 or 6 minutes so we can have any time for questions.
Okay, all right, that sounds good. So we have not reached peak pellets, right? This slide is probably 2 or 3 years old, but there's still expansion and of pellets and new mills coming in. Drax has built its own mills, and Viva is the major supplier that's not Drax for those mills. So now we're back to the question I was asking. Do pellets have an impact on pine pulpwood prices? So this is a study that was done at NC State by a PhD student. These are regions that have pellet mills in them, and these are regions that don't have pellet mills in them. So he did an analysis where this is the green regions are where pellet mills were included, and the red regions did not have pellet mills. And here's pellet capacity going up. And you can see there's a significant increase in pine pulpwood prices in regions where there are pellet mills. So we've explained why, because pulpwood's more important and pellets are a pretty important part in a tight market for it. So they are having a price impact. So that's important for my modeling. If I put in a demand and I see a price impact, then things are going to change, right? It makes forestry more valuable, for example, at the margin. So yes, they apparently are big enough to affect prices, because now we don't have to conjecture whether they're big enough. We can actually look at the price effect they've had. So this is, we're updating this article now, but this is an example of what that means. This is me running my model and adding in a projected at the time demand for pellets, but it turns out that projection was fairly accurate to the scale that actually showed up, and then trying to look at what happened to forest carbon. So when I put in pellet demand at 2009 and trended up similar to how consumption actually trend up, here's what I see. I do see pine plantation carbon going up and naturally regenerated carbon going down. In other words, this is an implication that at the margin, there were some natural stands, probably natural pine stands, that were converted to pine. So we lost carbon, forest carbon, in the naturally regenerated stands, and we gained it in the plantation. But the net effect is total forest carbon stayed about the same, right? There's a little bit of implication of an increase here and there, but it's stayed about the same. And what does that mean? That means that the price effect of adding this demand to the forest at the margin led to an increase in pine plantations, decrease in naturally regenerated, and the net effect of that was pretty much no change in forest carbon. So compared to a stand story where there's a carbon debt and like, we're going to cut these trees and how long does it take to replace these trees, the main implication of looking at it at a market level is if you're going to harvest more trees and you're big enough to have a price effect, then it's not that you're just harvesting trees. You don't get that many more trees harvested unless you increase prices. So at the instant that you're increasing demand for trees and increasing prices, that's the instant that it affects management of other stands. So there's not a lag in a single, like you'd see in a single stand case, because to get a significant increase in harvest, you have to have a price effect, and that price effect occurs at the beginning of the harvest, not at the end. And so what you see in models like mine and Justin and most others that include markets is there's an offset effect. And then say there's no trade-off. And by the way, this is not saying carbon neutral, right? This is not doing the full carbon accounting exercise. This is just looking at what's happening to forest carbon. This should improve the carbon status or the carbon score, but this not changing does not mean it's carbon neutral. It just means that the level of carbon in the forest stay the same, although the forest probably has some less biodiversity, and there's other effects which aren't captured here. But this is just looking at the forest carbon effect. So the carbon score of energy looks worse when you tend to look at small plots rather than landscapes because, like my example, at a small plot level, there is no market effect. So all it is a biological story about replacing carbon. If you're looking at forests, right, and you look at it in a short time frame, like what's going to happen with 5 or 10 years, that even in the southern forest, you know, looking at a stand level, it takes 20 years to have that carbon come back, right? So if you focus at the small scale, those factors are real. These other things are things that would affect the carbon score in any case, right? So if you had slow growing trees with uncertain regeneration, so you could talk about bottomland hardwoods in the south. Those trees grow slow, and if you cut a bottomland hardwood stand, actually the water table comes up, and you could go, if you have several wet years in a row, you may not get any regeneration. So, you know, unlike pine plantations, if this was the nature of your forest, this would hurt your carbon story. And the other thing is, you know, if you're doing the carbon stories, you have to assume what would have happened if we didn't use the trees for pellets. So if you assume that the trees will stay and sequester carbon, if you hadn't cut them, right, that hurts your carbon score. But in the US South, you know, there's not many forests that are not harvested, right? That's why the average age of the southern forest beyond pine plantations is so low. So, you know, if you ignore markets and land use, you'll get a worse carbon score, right? And again, I'm not arguing about carbon neutrality or anything else. I'm just talking about relative carbon store. These first two assumptions are part of the literature. There's a literature that does this, and there's a literature that does market. So the first two are just sort of modeling assumptions. But the biology of the southern forests doesn't fit this situation, right? The trees are likely to be harvested. That's sort of what's been happening in the South. There are land use and management responses. Trees are the default landscape in the South. If I don't mow my yard, I will end up with a mixed forest. So it's a very forgiving landscape, unlike out west, which is if you just leave land alone in the South, you'll get trees. I just want to mention here the ag markets matter too, right? I talked about the interface with ag. So if ag prices go down, that's another incentive for trees to move into marginal ag land. And if ag prices go up, it's a disincentive. So I'm not including the ag story, but I wanted to at least call out the ag story is a big part of this dynamic.
So we do have time for any questions. Any fellows have questions, raise your Zoom hand or stick something in the chat. I had one general question dealing with the your slide about the pellet demanded pine pulpwood prices and showing the regions that had mills and those that didn't, and how the ones that had wood pellet plants was going up. What does that mean for the small landowners out there who are getting approached by companies to turn over their land to sourcing in Viva or others? I mean, are the prices they're getting for their land, is that going to continue to go up? It will become a good time for them in the next few years if this demand curve continues?
Okay, so Chris, I have to admit that I was busy trying to find the share button during the first part of your question. So try that. Give me the brief version.
Yeah, so the chart that shows that the prices in the counties or the regions that have pellet mills, how that differs to the counties or regions that don't. It's going up in the regions that do. I'm just wondering, the small landowners out there, and we've learned that the Southeast is filled with these small landowners who have a few acres to dozens of acres. Is it going to increasingly be a good time for them to sell?
Sell timber or sell land?
I guess sell the timber.
So even though pulpwood is much more important than it used to be because sawtimber prices are so low, it's still half the price of sawtimber. So if I were a landowner, I would likely be much more influenced by a sawmill opening near me because at twice the price, I might change my rotation to produce more sawtimber. So so what this says is that the impact of the increase in pulpwood markets is measurable and would have an impact at the margin. And so, yes, I would say a landowner in Louisiana, Mississippi, where saw timber prices are stubbornly low, would be happy when a pellet mill moved close by. But I still wouldn't say it would be a game changer in that I wasn't going to harvest, but now I am, because that decision still would probably be based more on saw timber. But it would be along the lines of, when I do harvest and I get some pulpwood out of it, I could expect more income. So at the margin, yes, it matters, but it's not a game changer. And so income to forest landowners would go up when a pellet mill comes in. That's true.
This is a question from Mark Heller at ENE News. If the federal government, as a matter of policy, declares that biomass for energy production is carbon neutral, or better, maybe depending, how does that affect the economic picture you're looking at going forward?
So actually, I have a presentation where I have that slide in there. One of my points is that this is a very complicated story, right? It's not a soundbite story. There's a certain set of circumstances where this would be carbon. I think there's a lot of circumstances where it'd be better than coal. There's a few circumstances where it might be carbon neutral. But if the politicians in the US declare it carbon neutral, the US isn't the consumer of pellets. It doesn't. The EU is not going to say, oh, the US just declare it carbon neutral, we're going to drop our concerns about pellets. And as Grant mentioned, right, the US is a pretty small consumer of pellets. So to me, there's two things. And as an academic, having someone to come in and bypass all the science and declare a black and white answer to a great question is bothersome. And the other is, it isn't the US declaration about carbon neutral that matters for the pellet market. It's the UK and the EU thing. So that's my take on it. I think it's a political play for constituents. If the EU Parliament came out and made that would be a huge thing, but they're not anywhere close to doing that, right? They're very skeptical. So to me, we've seen that happen. I think it's a feel-good thing for some people in terms of trying to bypass the complications of science, but I really don't think it would have a large impact.
I have a question related to native environment and natural biodiversity in the South. You said that if land is left alone in the South, you'll get trees. But if the majority of forest is private, how does this affect the natural ecosystem? As in, are there biodiversity issues because of the plantations?
So pine plantations, compared to any of the other forest types, has less biodiversity. But my example, for example, if I didn't mow my yard and I came back in a decade, I would have a mixed pine hardwood forest. And I think if you look at construction sites around that stuff, whenever there's bare land with a pine source nearby, it comes back in pure pine, but it's not a pine plantation, right? It's different ages. And matter of fact, it may be 1,000 seedlings in a small area. So it's a forest. It's a forest cover. So I would, so at the margin of land use change where land is allowed to come back naturally in the forest, I think you would probably end up with a more biodiverse forest, but also it would be a less sequestration, right? It would be a lower growth, higher biodiversity forest would naturally come back. If the land was abandoned because it's got development potential, then it would only be 5 or 6 years before it would be turned into development, right? So.
All right, Bob. Well, I want to thank you very much for your helpful and informative presentation. We'll share that with the fellows, so they'll have access to your data and can review it later.